hello, ISTE. Thank you for having me. It's so great to be back in this space again to share in some learning with you. And we're going to be talking about speaking up about racial microaggressions in schools. So I had a doctor's appointment some time ago, squeezing in some self-care in between work and my other commitments. And I happened to be on the Upper East Side in my hometown of New York City. The Upper East Side houses one of the wealthiest zip codes in the city. And there I was hurrying off to beat the oncoming rush hour traffic. And just my luck, a taxi pulls up right in front of me as a woman was stepping out of it. And as she came out, she looked over at me and without an extra thought, she very dismissively said, "Oh no, honey, this type of taxi doesn't go to the Bronx." And genuinely, kindly shut the door for me as she walked away. Now, first of all, shout out to the Boogie Down Bronx, birthplace of hip hop, incredible people, and many things delicious, and for years a place that I've called home. But it also was a whole 20 or so minutes away at that moment and not where I was headed. If you're familiar, you know that the Bronx is one of the lowest income areas with many uninformed stereotypes often ascribed to it. So confused, I took a look around and to make sure she was actually talking to me. It shouldn't matter that I was actually headed downtown in the opposite direction to present at a board meeting. What mattered in that moment is that faster than her brain could process, this woman in a split second, based purely on what could only be my appearance, inaccurately summed up who I am, or at least where I was headed, and that I didn't somehow need that taxi. And she made a comment that she probably never thought twice about afterwards. I think of this story and so many others like it more often than I care to. For those of us who are part of any minoritized community, particularly those of us who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, you likely know why. Just like the worst and most untimely paper cut, these passing behaviors, though seemingly small in nature, come quickly, they're razor sharp, and they often cut in moments that we least suspect them. And yet, no matter how frequently they occur and how small they may seem, each time it can be equally flooring to realize just how much they can make you bleed. The worst part is that in all of their awfulness, they can seem at times so small that simply mentioning them can feel silly, questionable, or an open invitation for the gaslighting that usually follows. What this woman committed is what many of us know to be called a racial microaggression, a manifestation of racism that surfaces not just with New Yorkers getting out of cabs, but everywhere. And certainly in schools, and certainly from white people, and certainly, by the way, from people of color towards other people of color, and certainly during a pandemic, and certainly during any other time of the year. And these moments too often pass by us without anyone speaking up, or worse yet, leaving the people who are bleeding in the moment to be the ones to have to call it out. So I'm left then with this question: who should speak up in these moments? Who is best positioned to do so, and when and why? Spoiler alert, just as with any other injury, it likely shouldn't be the person who's bleeding out in the moment. So let's start first by getting clear about what microaggressions are. Microaggressions of all types exist. Today we're focusing specifically on racial microaggressions. They're brief, commonplace, daily verbal, behavioral, or other unintentional or intentional, hostile, derogatory racial slights and insults towards people of color. They come in a variety of forms: micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations. If you happen to be in the audience at my TED Masterclass talk last year on the ISTE 2019 stage, you may remember my message that schools can dangerously perpetuate inequity when we're not mindful. I share that schools perpetuate inequity through silence. I shared at that time that schools perpetuate inequity through silence, fear, resistance, and many other ways that keep racism alive and thriving. One of the many manifestations of that is through microaggressions. It can feel counterintuitive to believe that these institutions where families drop off their most precious little people to be loved upon and nurtured can cause harm. Yet within the walls of so many learning communities, students are regularly subject to various manifestations of racism, including racial microaggressions. Reports of students being asked questions like, wow, you speak English so well when they're American, or are you sure you're in the right class because auto shop is down the hall? Similar to my taxi story, one of the many ways it serves is in saying, you don't belong here. Why are you stressing? Asians are naturally good at math. These examples of day in and day out, the experiences of students who don't fit into dominant norms or categories live through the everyday slights. And it's not just students, the adults bear it too. Families, teachers, custodial staff, across the board, adults often find themselves inflicted by these harms. Some comments are more cutting than others, but they all bring about the bleeding. Students of color in one report were almost 2 times as likely as white students to report having observed and experienced a professor telling a joke that mocked or degraded their racial or ethnic group. In another study of Mexican immigrant students in elementary school, 42% perceived themselves to be the target of teacher discrimination at least once by 4th grade. Another report of immigrant youth by adolescents said that up to 2 to 3 times a year, they experienced ethnic discrimination from their teachers, just about. So math teachers perceived their classes to be too difficult for Latino and Black students in this report showed that the effect of their attitudes towards these students impacted GPAs by up to -0.2 GPA points. The effects can be so much larger. Racial microaggressions have a number of other consequences, including those that impact the mental health of students, the hostile and invalidating climate that are created around them, and a host of other transgressions that students of color are constantly carrying around them. These microaggressions affect more than just the people on the receiving end. Students who simply observed or experienced racialized microaggressions reported decreased class participation. But in the group in this study, 73% also reported negative impacts on their social emotional well-being simply by having witnessed them. You're hopefully familiar with Dr. Bettina Love's incredible work and her book entitled, We Want to Do More Than Just Survive. Get her book if you haven't, and by the way, support independent bookstores when you do. Among many things, she reminds us that racism literally murders your spirit. It's traumatic because it's a loss of protection, safety, nurturance, and many things that students inherently deserve from their schools. Among many things, she reminds us that, for example, when we characterize a Black child's hair as a distraction, so to speak, and write school policies that ban styles like dreadlocks and afros, mohawks, and other faddish styles, these policies and these mindsets are not just about hair. They're often informed by racist ideas, and in this case, Black people's unfitness or unattractiveness and inferiority. If this mindset informs policies, why wouldn't the everyday so-called slips of the tongue follow suit? Now, on the other hand, we tend to see a positive impact on the flip side when this dynamic can be flipped on its head. In one example, students who were taught by teachers who were taught strategies to boost and sustain their high expectations of their students, those students had math scores fall 28% higher than their peers who did not have teachers who had this training. So it brings me back to that word microaggressions, in particular, the prefix micro, which means everything small. What you probably see that I'm getting at is that these microaggressions are micro in name only. They are micro in name, but not in their impact. They're micro in name, but not in their indignity. They're micro in name, but not in their ignorance. The impactful work of various critical race theorists help us to understand the immense impact of these microaggressions, and anti-racist thought leaders frequently push us to recognize the misnomer in the term. There's very little that is micro about them to those who matter the most, i.e. those who are on the receiving end of them. So the term, in my mind, will forever earn air quotes from me. And more importantly, I ask, how do we get better about speaking up about them until they no longer exist? Now, I want to make an important distinction as I share these thoughts with you. It's too often that those of us on the receiving end of oppression are expected to carry out the emotional labor of speaking up to dismantle it. What's the role of the offender, or of those around who behold power enough to do something for change? It is to speak up until that dynamic of power and racial inequity no longer exists. So as I call on all of us to speak up more, I want to make clear that for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, racism is exhausting, and we're hurting. And we stand on too many shoulders of those before us to not center our self-care and our healing so that we can last. So in moments when you can step in, by all means do so. But recognize the moments when you can't and you shouldn't, and tap out until you're ready. So white people, it means if you're really about this inequity and this equity and anti-racism work of which we speak, we need you to play more of a role in speaking up when fitting. What might it look like if people on the receiving end of microaggressions could rely on others around them to be true champions for anti-racism and equity in the moment? What might it look like to remove this work from those most impacted and put the onus instead on others to speak up? In my daily work, I have the privilege of coaching and supporting education leaders near and far with various aspects of their leadership practices, and in those practices, centering anti-racism and equity meaningfully all the time. These leaders strive to show up differently, stronger in their work every day, to do better for students, to engage in the uncomfortable work that is required of them, to provide students, families, and staff the inclusive, responsive, and anti-racist learning environments that they all deserve. Where we're seeing the most palpable and meaningful impact are in those leaders and in their communities who are taking steps to do some of the following that I'll share with you. And I implore you to consider doing the same. The first is simple: be ready. We've heard some of our speakers earlier this evening talk about getting informed. If you're still holding on to notions of race neutrality, please let go and educate yourself as to why. If these issues in anti-racism and equity still haven't made it onto your radar, your list of priorities and non-negotiables, well, I'm hoping I've helped you to move the needle in some way today. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, allow me a moment also to hold us all accountable where fitting. We're often so complicit without even realizing it, at times committing the very harms against students and other adults around us that we're fighting against when they're committed against us. So if this is also your work to do, then let's get to it. There are times when our own actions are causing harm to communities of color, sometimes our own, and we need solidarity across communities to dismantle inequity from its core. For all of us, part of being ready for this work is to also establish a shared language and a shared lens as a community through which to examine and tackle racial inequities when they surface, and get fluent in it. That way, you recognize microaggressions as soon as you see them. You cultivate a community that's invested in and obsessed about this need for a change. And you have the tools to have the challenging conversations to ensure that they don't resurface. Leaders in the room, I want to talk to you for just a moment. I want to ask, what are you doing to create the conditions for this to happen effectively in your schools and all the time? Where are you investing the time, the money, the resources? But where are you also modeling the desired behaviors you wish to see through your own heavy work, your own personal reflection and actions? The one workshop, the one book club, the one sign hanging down the hallway doesn't really cut it. It must be ongoing, meaningful work that demands plurality, agility, and true mastery of this mindset and skill set until inequities are no longer an issue. I want to implore everyone to speak up. Again, speak up when the moment is right. Silence is extremely costly, and we need to be not okay with that. If you're the person in the moment who I'm calling on to speak up, then do, even when the words aren't perfect. Catalyze the conversation and don't let the moment go by. I need you to also put the gaslight out. If someone calls you into this conversation, get genuinely humble, lean on inquiry. It can be hard, but take responsibility and stop making others feel as if the issues that they're bringing up don't matter. Apologize for your wrongdoings. And lastly, just do better. It's likely that I'll never forget my missed taxi on the Upper East Side that day. And though that lady in the story don't deserve the real estate that they take up in my mind sometimes, these memories, they stick because they sting. A couple of people were passing by within earshot that day outside of the doctor's office, and they saw this interaction. And I'm wondering, how different would this story be if someone in that moment and so many others like it spoke up so that I wouldn't have to? I'm so excited for the day that I run out of these stories to tell. It was such a pleasure to join you during ISTE 2019 to talk about how schools perpetuate inequity, and so much has changed in our world since then. Yet, so much depressingly still stays the same. How much have you changed in that time? I hope that when I come back and join you the next time, we won't be having the same conversation. Thank you.